Secretary General will make some opening remarks and then has to leave, and then our two guests will take questions. Sir, please.
Good morning and good afternoon. Half of our world is sinking into a development disaster fueled by a crushing debt crisis. That is the main message of the report we are presenting today, A World of Debt. Some 3.3 billion people, almost half of humanity, live in countries that spend more on debt interest payments than on education or health. And yet, because most of these unsustainable debts are concentrated in poor countries, they are not judged to pose a systemic risk to the global financial system. This is a mirage. 3.3 billion people is more than a systemic risk. It's a systemic failure. Markets may seem not to be suffering, yet people are. And some of the poorest countries in the world are being forced into a choice between servicing their debt or serving their people. They have virtually no fiscal space for essential investments in the Sustainable Development Goals or the transition to renewable energy. Levels of public debt are staggering and surging. In 2022, global public debt reached the record 92 trillion US dollars, and developing countries shoulder a disproportionate amount. A growing share is held by private creditors who charge sky-high interest rates to many developing countries. On average, African countries pay 4 times more for borrowing than the United States and 8 times more than the wealthiest European countries. The International Monetary Fund says 36 countries are on so-called debt row, either in or at high risk of debt distress. Another 16 are paying unsustainable interest rates to private creditors. A total of 52 countries, almost 40% of the developing world, are in serious debt trouble. It is one result of the inequality built into our outdated global financial system, which reflects the colonial power dynamics of the era when it was created. The system has not fulfilled its mandate as a safety net to help all countries manage today's cascade of unforeseen shocks, the pandemic, the devastating impact of the climate crisis, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Debt is an important financial tool that can drive development and enable governments to protect and invest in their people. But when countries are forced to borrow for their economic survival, debt becomes a trap that simply generates more debt. Today's report is our most detailed picture yet of this unfolding debt crisis with a health of comparisons and context. It also sets out our roadmap to global financial stability, a roadmap already put forward in our policy briefs on reforms of the global financial architecture and the SDG stimulus. Deep reforms to the global financial system will not happen overnight, but there are many steps we can take right now. Our proposals include an effective debt workout mechanism that supports payment suspensions, longer lending terms, and lower rates, including for vulnerable middle-income countries. And governments can agree right now to scale up development and climate finance by increasing the capital base and changing the business model of multilateral development banks. They can enable much stronger coordination between the banks to transform their approach to risk without losing their AAA credit rating, so that they can massively leverage private finance at affordable costs to developing countries. The Bridgetown Agenda, led by Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, and the recent summit hosted by President Macron of France, generated other important proposals. The upcoming G20 summit is an opportunity to take these ideas forward. Action will not be easy, but it is essential and urgent. Today's report shows that time is up for 3.3 billion people. Thank you. And I leave you in more competent hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Great. Thank you very much. From Rebecca Greenspan, who will present the report, and then we'll hear from the Executive Secretary. Rebecca, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Secretary General that laid the ground with such insightful and also passionate remarks. So let me go into the technical aspects and share with you the report, aware of that, to supplement the Secretary General's remarks. I have 5 points to make to you. My first point is that we have to recognize the sheer magnitude and speed at which public debt has grown. You can see, if you have, those of you that have the report in figure 1, that since 2000, global public debt has surged more than 5-fold, significantly outpacing global GDP growth that has only tripled in the same period. And the thing here is that public debt is growing faster in developing countries than in the developed world, even when you exclude China. That is figure 2 of the report. So public debt, as the Secretary General said, can be a very important development tool. Governments use it to finance their expenditures, to protect and invest in their people, and to pave the way for a better future. But it can be also a very heavy burden when public debt grows too much or too fast. This is what is happening today across the developing world. Public debt has reached colossal levels, largely because of 2 factors. One, the first factor is that the financing needs soared with countries' effort to fend off the impact of the cascading crisis on development, of the systemic shocks. That is not of their own doing, it's a global phenomenon. So COVID-19 pandemic, the cost of living crisis that we are going through, and climate change has made it necessary for them to indebt themselves at a faster speed. The second reason is the unequal international financial architecture that makes developing countries access to financing inadequate and expensive, as you have heard from the Secretary General. They have experienced rising borrowing costs due to the hikes and increases in the interest rates in the reserve central banks. They have experienced currency devaluations because of that, and they are experiencing, according to what the IMF has shared with us, sluggish growth also. So these factors compromise their ability to react to emergencies, tackle climate change, and invest in their people and their future. Let me give you one indicator. The threshold established for saying that countries are in a ratio of debt to GDP that needs attention is 60%. This is an international benchmark. And if you reach 60% of debt in proportion to your GDP, so you have to watch it. And the number of countries that have gone into 60% or higher have gone from 22 countries in 2011 to 59 countries in 2022. For a reference, this number is higher than what we saw when the HIPC plan was agreed. So we are here in a high watermark of the multilateral community that has done HIPC when they thought that this was a very important action to take. So another measure is the external public debt. So that is the part of the government's debt owed to foreign creditors. And that increased in the developing countries from 19% of GDP to 29% in GDP in a decade. So comparing debt levels to developing countries' ability to generate foreign exchange for their exports, that also show that that ability has diminished. External public debt as a share of exports has gone from 71% to 112% in 2021. And also in terms of the service of the debt, as a share of exports, then we have almost doubled the number that was in 2010. And we have gone from 3.9% to 7.4%. So I know that you cannot, remember all these indicators, but let me just give you a benchmark. After the Second World War, it was established that Germany should pay only 5% in service of the debt with respect to their exports, 5%, and it included public and private debt. And we are already at 7.4% average in the developing world, only counting for public debt. My third point, very quickly, as the SG said, is the composition of debt that has changed, complicating the efforts to manage and restructure it. So in 2021, private creditors represented 62% of developing countries' external debt, and 47% of developing countries' external debt. 2021 is 62%. So while these private sources can provide essential liquidity to the countries, usually there are less favorable terms for that debt, and that makes it the restructuring more complex and also the debt more expensive. And as we have said very often, we have the G20 Common Framework, we have the IMF Roundtable for Debt. Those are very welcome step forwards, but they have not been able to establish a more structured mechanism for debt restructuring yet. And the last point here is how much more the developing countries are paying for their debt than the developed countries. You heard the numbers from the SG. You can look in figure 7 of the report that Africa is paying 11.6% average on their debt, while the US is 3.1 and Germany is 1.5. So you can imagine that this burden is impossible to sustain for these developing countries. My fourth point, like the Secretary General said, is that the markets are not worried, but people is suffering. And here are the numbers of the countries that are paying more in servicing their debt than in investing in basic needs or SDG sectors for the transformation of their economies. And the rapid increase of interest payments is squeezing out spending in these key areas. Interest rates have grown much faster than all the other sectors, much faster than education, than investment, and than health. In Africa, the amount spent on interest payments is higher than spending on either education or health. In developing countries in Asia and Oceania and in the regional part, Armida will extend, excluding China, are allocating more funds to interest payments than to health. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, developing countries are devoting much more money to interest payments than to investment. And that is why the private sector also is suffering, because it constrains the flows of essential finance to small local businesses in developing countries, limiting productive investments. So across the world, rising debt burdens are keeping countries from investment in sustainable development. And in all these areas, you can see the numbers in the report. The number of countries in that situation is simply growing. So that's why the Secretary General has said 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on interest than health or education. So my last point is that we made, with this report, we made a vulnerability analysis comparing the analysis that we did last year with this year to see what the situation was. And what we can say is that this year we have 30 countries that have become more vulnerable since last year, while only 10 countries have become less vulnerable. So in a net number, 103 countries are highly vulnerable in at least one of the three pillars of the GCRG: food and fertilizers, energy, or finance, compared to 94 last year. 49 countries are perfect storm countries with the highest vulnerability score across all three pillars. Also up from 36 countries last year. 36 last year, 49 this year. And 20 out of these 49 countries that are in a perfect storm are in sub-Saharan Africa. So let me stop here, but just finishing saying that we have launched the World of Debt Report in an interactive website hosted at the UN with an interactive dashboard where every person and every policymaker in the world can see the state of the debt of their country. So I also invite you to go there. That is a very breakthrough work in the UN together with UNDP, with DESA, with the regional commissions. This was possible. So let me thank the technical team and the organizations that were so cooperative for this to be possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And then before we take questions, I want to hand over to the Executive Director of ESCAP to give you a more regional perspective. Please, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Good morning, good afternoon. I will complement Rebecca's presentation by looking at the debt issues from the regional perspectives, the amount, debt composition, as well as the interest payment. Between 2010 and 2022, the amount of general government debts increased by about 4 times in Asia and the Pacific, 3 times in Africa, and 2.5 times in Europe and Central Asia. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the increase is smaller at about 1.6 times. So this is on the amount. On the composition of debt, external public debt still accounts for half of the total public debt stocks in all developing regions. This makes developing countries highly vulnerable to economic shocks, which is what we all witnessed during the recent food, energy, and financial crisis. Another key development is the changing creditor landscape. I think Rebecca already mentioned this, but just to reiterate, private creditors have now become the largest creditor group in all developing regions. In Latin America and Caribbean, about 3/4, actually already majority, of external public and publicly guaranteed debt are owed to private creditors. Along with rising government debt levels, the interest payment burden is adding more pressure. In the past decade, the number of developing countries paying over 10% of their government revenues on interest increased in all regions. So across the board, it has increased. In 2022, this was the case in at least 21 African countries. So higher interest payments mean that less resources are available for people in terms of social services, basic services, and so on. So in all developing regions, net interest payments on public debt grew faster than public spending on education, healthcare, and development, in other development investment. Again, to breakdown across the region, in Africa, the continent spent more on interest payments than on education or health spending. In Europe and Central Asia, government spending on education and public investment have dropped by at least 20%, while interest payments increased by 80%. So it's stark difference, yeah. And half of the population in Africa, Asia Pacific, and Latin America and Caribbean are living in countries where government spending on education or health is lower than net interest payment. Beyond the amount of debt itself, the large interest payment burden is driven by the high cost of sovereign borrowing. In Africa, the yield of their international sovereign bonds is almost 9 percentage points higher than the US benchmark rate. In Latin America and the Caribbean, this figure is close to 5 percentage points. Most striking, countries such as Argentina, Pakistan, Tunisia have to pay $1 of interest for every $4 they borrow every year, so already a quarter, yeah? Just to pay for the interest payment out of the dollar they borrow every year. So again, in summary, all these numbers underscore the need to make cheaper, longer-term financing available for developing countries worldwide. The SDG stimulus already calls for bold actions by the international community. So all 5 regional commissions will work to address public debt challenges to effectively pursue the sustainable development, of course, together with UNCTAD and UNDP. Closing revenue gaps, improving spending efficiency and effectiveness, and better management of public debt remain key to reduce debt distress. Together with all development partners, we will work to promote common international debt resolution mechanism and restructuring framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ma'am. We'll take some questions. Edie Letter, Associated Press.
Thank you both very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. I have a question for Madam Greenspan. Actually, I have 2, but the first one is, the Secretary General said that the upcoming G20 summit could take action. What actions would you like to see the G20 take? And we could not have you here without asking about the upcoming expiration of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Last Friday, Martin Griffiths said that you wanted to go to Moscow this week. Are you planning to go? Are you having talks with the Russians? And what are your expectations for an extension? Thank you very much.
Go ahead, Rebecca. Thank you. All right, hold on, you're muted. Hold on, I'd ask. Can you try again? No? Okay. Hold on, time. Just hold on, we're trying to fix things. Yeah. 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 Sorry, just be patient with us a few more minutes, Rebecca. I know you're dying to answer the
Yeah.
question. Okay, go ahead. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you very much for the question. So let me go first to the G20 question that is very important. First of all, the SG said very clearly that there are things that decisions that can be taken now within the present framework. Some of them are the following. One is the RST, the Resilient and Sustainability Trust that was established last year, where $100 billion of recycling of SDRs, special drawing rights, was promised. So what we want is the disbursement of these 100 billion that have been pledged, so the RST can really act at scale. And the RST is now in the IMF, so the disbursement of the special drawing rights to go to scale and speed in the support to countries. The second thing that can be done in the framework of the IMF is really to increase the quota access to the windows for emergency financing, because many countries used all the space that they had to go for these tools in the IMF with the pandemic. So we need the quotas to go up so countries can really have access to liquidity in these times of crisis and to contingency finance through the IMF windows. We are also pushing hard for the multilateral development banks to be capitalized on the one hand and for them to do more with what they have, both. And the multilateral, for example, the World Bank is today 1/5 of what it was in the 60s with respect to the global GDP. So in fact, the bank has become smaller while the problems have become larger. And so we need that the capitalization of the World Bank and of the multilateral development banks will be taken seriously so we can scale up the investments for the SDGs and for the energy transition. And our third plea is on debt. We need a working debt mechanism that will be able to restructure debt much faster. You know that the common framework have allowed, and the IMF roundtable have allowed for 2 countries to restructure their debt, Chad and Zambia. Zambia was announced in the Paris summit. We have Ghana and Sri Lanka that are trying also to restructure their debt. But we have a lot of countries that are in debt distress, and they don't want to go to the common framework and to the restructuring process because they cannot wait 2.5 years to have a resolution like happened to Zambia. So we need a faster and improved mechanism for debt restructuring. That is what we propose in the IFA policy brief in the UN. And we also are asking for a standstill of the debt servicing for while they are renegotiating. Because you know that the credit rating agencies downgrade the countries that go into the mechanism, yes? So their finance becomes more expensive, and they don't have any benefit while they are negotiating. So if there will be a standstill in the debt, in the interest debt servicing, as was proposed even by the World Bank and the IMF in the past to improve the common framework, then the countries will have an incentive to come to the table and have an orderly debt restructuring. So at least in those 3 schemes, I think that there is a whole list in the documents that we have shared that go more into detail on this. With respect to the Black Sea Initiative, we are still in contact, negotiating, pushing. We do believe that the 2 agreements signed in Istanbul are of vital importance for food security. So under the leadership of the Secretary General, we have continued negotiating, proposing, and being in contact to try to secure the extension of the Black Sea Initiative and the full implementation of the Memorandum of Understanding with the Russian Federation.
On my question of whether you're going to Moscow this week,
Uh,
I think
Doesn't
that was the
seem
answer.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pam, then Sherwin.
Thank you, Secretary General. Pamela Falk from CBS News. A follow-up to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Have you made, what can you tell us about progress you've made on Russian demands on the SWIFT banking system and the Agricultural Bank of Russia and any other things that Russia is asking for? And on the debt, you talked about 4 recommendations. Is she talking to us?
No, go ahead,
No.
she's hearing you.
There are several recommendations, including the debt mechanism, but you don't talk about debt relief, which, as you know, happened in the 1980s with Latin America. It's happened before. Any partial or full debt relief that you're calling for, and why not if not? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we have made progress in the Memorandum of Understanding. We have made progress in insurance and shipping freights that have gone down. We have secured the general licensing from the US and from the UK that have allowed for the food and fertilizer exemptions really to be operational, let's say, to be concrete, and to allow for the private sector, lowering the risk to trade on food and fertilizers with the Russian Federation. Actually, the exports of food and fertilizer from the Russian Federation have normalized slowly during this year. With respect to the Russian Agricultural Bank, we have been able to secure alternative ways to the SWIFTing problem. And now, as was reported, I think that a week ago, we are trying to, within the sanction framework, to be able to provide a more expedite way for them to do their operations. But it's true that this is one of the challenges that has not yet fully happened. Yes, that we haven't fully find the solution for the Russian Agricultural Bank. But we have put a proposal forward to try to solve the problem that the Russian Agricultural Bank has, and we expect that this solution can really be of great help for what the Russian Agricultural Bank wants to achieve. Only for food and fertilizers, yes, not for the other operations of the Russian Agricultural Bank. With respect to debt, the proposal in the debt mechanism de facto is a mechanism for debt restructuring. And debt restructuring means debt relief, yes? And that's why also we think that the relief has also to come early in the process, and that's why we are proposing a standstill of interest service from the beginning. If you come to the mechanism that has been agreed, so you will receive a standstill in your interest while you restructure. So you are not an outlaw in terms of your debt, yes? And but you are right. What the intention, the objective of proposing a better mechanism to improve the mechanisms that are in place is precisely to give the countries the debt relief necessary for them to normalize their situation and get into a stable path of growth and inclusion.
Sherwin, then Dulcie.
Good to see you, Ms. Greenspan. Sherwin Briceby, South African Broadcasting. It sounds like debt per se is not the issue. The issue here is how much interest developing countries are saddled with when those debts are afforded to them. If you take the United States, for example, it has a debt to GDP ratio of 129%. Credit rating agencies don't panic. The minute South Africa, for example, reaches 70% to GDP ratio, you know, all sorts of wheels start spinning. Credit rating agencies start commenting. So there seems to be a disparity in how the two groups are being tackled. I mean, if you look at the graph in the report, 60% of debt is with the rich countries. No one panics about that because their interest rates are so low. So it seems to be a huge disparity that is at the core of your issue here, right?
Absolutely. We are with you. And you said it better than I did. The developed world has debt ratios that are higher than the developing world. But the developing world pays much more for their debt than the developed world. And the increase in the interest rates that has happened during this year has been an incredible burden for the developing world, because when they have to refinance in the market their debt, they have to go to refinance at much higher interest rates. And if you look in the report at the curves, you will see that it's precisely after the pandemic or after 2019 that we see really a steep slope in a higher debt and higher servicing of the debt. That is one of the important disparities that the SG referred to in his remarks. And here the credit agencies play a very important role, because they, if you look at the macroeconomics many times, at the debt burden, at the fundamentals, indicators in economics, you don't understand why some of the developing countries are punished in the way they are punished in the credit rating agencies. And so we have two problems here. We have the problem of the cost of the debt that is related also to the way these countries are treated by the credit rating agencies.
Thank you. Dulcie?
Thanks very much. I wanted to go back to the Black Sea grain deal. Are you basically saying that Russia is not satisfied with the scale of the fertilizer ammonia exports at this point? Because you did say that there is some trickle, but I mean, what seems to be Russia's challenge here to you?
You know that Russia has stopped to publish their data, their export data. But so what we have is the reports from the Russian Grain Association and the Russian Fertilizer Association. And both of them have said that the exports of grain and fertilizers during this year, they expect to get to the levels or even higher in the case of grain, because they had a very good harvest, higher than before. Ammonia is a different thing, because ammonia has suffered very much from exports because the inability of Russia to be able to use their former channels, including the Togliatti-Yuzhny pipeline. So ammonia has gone down almost 70% in terms of exports. But the rest of the fertilizers have really picked up, and they have almost normalized their numbers with respect to previous years. And grains, as I said, according to the numbers coming out from these associations, have also reached very high numbers in 2022. Now, the question is that there are still obstacles that they face, especially in the financial sector, to be able, and the other problem that we are seeing is the distribution of those exports. Yes, the number of countries that have had access to the exports of Russia has diminished. And this is especially problematic for fertilizers and for grain for Africa. Yes, because a lot of their trade routes have been disrupted. And a lot of that disruption now, at the beginning was everything, yes, insurance and shipping and freights. But right now is a lot, is the problems in the financial sector. And that's where the Russian Agricultural Bank comes in, that was de-swifted, and we haven't been able to re-swift the bank, but we have proposed alternative ways to solve the problem. That is what I explained earlier.
Can I just ask one follow-up? So your proposal for the Russian Agricultural Bank is alternatives, and you mentioned U.S. and maybe you said U.K. So is Russia putting all the onus on you to make this happen, or what are they doing at their end?
Well, the Memorandum of Understanding that we signed with Russia states that we will do whatever we can to support the unimpeded exports of food and fertilizers from the Russian Federation. And so that's what we are trying to do, yes, to fulfill our commitments, our commitment in the Memorandum of Understanding.
Thank you. We'll go to Louis for Indo-Asian News Service, and we'll take a question online. Go ahead.
This is Arun Luis from Indo-Asian News Service. I have a couple of questions, and thanks for taking up my questions. One is on the dilemma of debt. Could you care to comment on that? Which is that countries do need debt to increase their debt for developmental purposes, and sort of linked to that is also the unproductive or vanity uses of debt, which have made a problem for certain countries. So there's a difference between the use of debt. And the second one is, have there been any studies done on the military expenditures and their impact on countries mounting debts? And thank you.
Yeah, also very, very good questions. Thank you. Yes, obviously, most of the developing countries have capital deficits to be able to do the investments that they require. So that gap can be filled by direct investment coming to the countries or by debt, yes? And when the debt is well used to expand the productive capacity of the countries, the infrastructure, and the basic needs of its people, so it has a very high return. Yeah. The problem is when you have done that and suddenly debt has become much more expensive, and so you are no longer in a sustainable path because you have to dedicate a lot of your revenues inside the country or the revenues from export to pay your debt. If the debt is ill used, it's even worse. Like you say, it depends how it is used, but it is well used. Even if it is well used, you can be in trouble. And what we are saying is that many of the countries are in trouble because of systemic shocks, not because necessarily of the country's individual decisions. The pandemic, climate change, and the cost of living crisis have put a very heavy burden in the sustainability of the debt of the developing countries. With respect to the other thing is that what we are saying is that the conditions also matter a lot. If you need debt for development, you need debt that will have a long-term period. And that usually is not given by the private sector, is given by the development banks. And that's why we are insisting that the development banks have to be recapitalized and they have to use the resources to scale up the support to developing countries and to leverage private investment for the transformation to sustainable development that these countries need. With respect to the military, I cannot answer because I don't have the data. And we, in the GCRG, we have not done work on this regard. But you are absolutely right. I am sure other organizations have, but I have not followed properly on that. So
Thank you.
I cannot answer.
We're going to take two quick last questions and to let you go, Rebecca. We'll go to Catherine from France 24, who's online. Catherine?
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Stefan. Hello, Rebecca. I'm based in Geneva. Funny to have to ask you your question online like that. But I'd like to come back on what you just mentioned about restructuring the debt. In the report, you say that developing countries rely more on private creditors. So that is also the problem. Seems to be the problem is that they don't know where to turn to get money, to borrow money in order to pay their debt. And wouldn't it be a solution that at least the 30 most hit countries could have a cancellation of their debts? Thank you.
Yes. Yes, thank you, Catherine. Thank you. Very good question. Well, first of all, the restructuring of the debt will have to include the private sector. Yes, and that has been part of the call since the common framework was put forward by the G20. And the conversation with the private sector has to happen for them to be included in the restructuring, because what some of the other actors are saying is that they don't want a free ride for the private sector. If not everybody gets into the restructuring, so some are restructuring for you to pay to other debtors, yes? And so there is not equality of treatment with respect to the restructuring. That is part of the discussions that are being held. And with respect to cancellation of debt, there are voices that are already calling for the cancellation of debts. My experience in my country is that it depends on your negotiation. Yes, if you start from the beginning saying, just cancel my debt, so maybe you don't have a way forward, yes? If 90% of your debt is canceled, or 80% or 70%, because there is a good negotiation looking at the models for sustainability and having an orderly conversation, maybe that will be a better way forward. Now, I cannot rule out that there are some countries that will find that there is no way that they can get to a sustainable path. In those cases, maybe the cancellation has to be put forward. But it really is a question of strategy. If the countries will want to start with a proposition to cancel, they will have to demonstrate that they have no possibility to pay.
You're off the hook. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time. We hope to see you back here in person at some point. And thank you all for coming. Bye-bye.